everyone, very glad to see you again. In the previous lesson, we have covered the regulation of hypothalamus pituitary gonad axis in the male, including the primary male hormones. Since female reproductive physiology is a bit more complicated, we will devote 2 sections to cover female reproductive functions. Learning objectives: list the functions of estrogen and progesterone. Interpret the process of follicle development and ovulation. Predict clinical manifestations associated with estrogen deficiency. As usual, let's begin this lesson with a case. A 52-year-old woman came to the clinic complaining that her period had stopped for 2 years. Blood tests suggested a low estrogen level. Now the question is, except for no periods, what other symptoms or signs would this woman have? Before answering this question, let's first see how the follicles grow up in the ovary, because they are the major sources of female sex hormones. At about 8 to 10 weeks of fetal development, precursor granulosa cells begin to surround the oocytes. This oocyte granulosa cell complex is called a primordial follicle. At between 20 and 24 weeks gestation, this follicle develops into a primary follicle. As granulosa cells proliferate, a clear gelatinous material surrounds the ovum, forming the zona pellucida. This larger unit is called a secondary follicle. At puberty, there are about 400,000 secondary follicles, and the oocytes inside are considered as primary oocytes. Before puberty, the primary oocytes do not undergo division, so no new primary oocytes will be formed during a woman's reproductive life. During each reproductive cycle, a cohort of follicles is recruited for development. However, generally only one, the dominant follicle, finally matures to a tertiary follicle and released during ovulation, while the remaining follicles undergo atraxia. In the meantime, the primary oocyte undergoes meiosis I, becoming a secondary oocyte to be released or ovulated in the follicle. In a person's lifetime, only about 400 follicles containing secondary oocytes are finally ovulated. Before ovulation, the mature follicle reaches mean diameter of about 18 to 25 milliliter. The LH surge, which is induced by significant increased level of estrogen via positive feedback that we have talked about, initiates a sequence of structural and biochemical changes resulting in ovulation. Ovulation takes place when the follicle gradually collapses and the oocyte is expelled into the peritoneal cavity. This process ranges from several minutes to more than 1 hour. After ovulation, the granulosa cells of the ruptured follicle undergo luteinization. These luteinized granulosa cells, plus the surrounding thicker cells, capillaries, and connective tissue, form the corpus luteum, which produces large amounts of progesterone and some estrogen. The normal functional lifespan of the corpus luteum is about 9 to 10 days. After it regresses, menstruation occurs and the corpus luteum is gradually replaced by an avascular scar called a corpus albicans. These events occurring in the ovary completes a cycle. The story is continuous if pregnancy occurs. The secondary oocyte undergoes meiosis too when it is fertilized. The corpus luteum will continue to serve as a transient progesterone and estrogen source rather than undergo regression until the placenta takes over this function. Now we know how follicles grow. Next, we would like to talk about the female sex hormones which are secreted during the follicle development. While only one hormone, testosterone, dominates and generates the primary and secondary characteristics in male, two major hormones, estrogen and progesterone, together are responsible for development of sexual characteristics and maintenance of female reproductive functions. At puberty, estrogen and progesterone both bring about the primary sexual characteristics with maturation of the female reproductive organs, the fallopian tubes, the uterus, the cervix, and the vagina. Estrogen and progesterone also regulate the reproductive functions in different ways. First, let's talk about estrogen. During follicular development of the female reproductive cycle, estrogen is mainly produced by granulosa cells, while the major source of estrogen comes from corpus luteum after ovulation. Estrogen is responsible for female secondary sexual characteristics. It stimulates the growth of breasts with hyperplasia of the glands and ducts of the mammary glands. It also widens the hips as well as adding fat on the buttocks and thighs, thus shaping a young woman full of curves. At the systemic level, estrogen has a protective effect on the cardiovascular system by keeping the blood vessels elastic and adjusting cholesterol levels. It promotes absorption of calcium and bone formation. It also causes water retention. The progesterone is mainly produced by the corpus luteum followed by ovulation, as we mentioned previously. The major function of progesterone is to prepare the uterus for pregnancy. It inhibits irritability of uterine muscle, thus facilitating embryo implantation. It also promotes the development of acini in the breast. Another important function of progesterone is elevating the basal temperature. Therefore, just by measuring the temperature daily, we can find out whether ovulation has taken place. Now let's go back to the case at the beginning. The 52-year-old woman without any periods for 2 years is most likely due to menopause. Menopause is a physiological phenomenon with permanent cessation of menstruation, which normally happens around 50. The significant drop of estrogen will lead to atrophy of reproductive organs such as uterus, ovaries, and vagina. The increased risk of cardiovascular diseases and osteoporosis should be kept in mind in postmenopausal women. Finally, let's summarize our lesson today. Follicles are divided into stages as primordial follicles, primary follicles, secondary follicles, and tertiary follicles. During each cycle, only one dominant follicle matures and ovulates. Primary oocytes do not divide during reproductive life. They undergo meiosis I during follicle maturation and complete meiosis II when fertilization occurs. Estrogen and progesterone are produced during follicle development and corpus luteum formation, mainly to regulate reproductive functions. Here are the references for this lesson. We will continue to talk about the female reproductive function in the next section. See you then!